Hello, everyone. Welcome into another episode of Bull Breakdowns here on the Guilty as Charged podcast YouTube channel. My name is Alex. As always, we are here to talk about Week 17 of Chargers Patriots. I wanted to do a Q&A and take some of your guys' best questions and answers as the Chargers head down the stretch into this playoff, season that they are expected to have, and they can clinch a win with the Patriots. Clinch the playoffs against the Patriots with a win, as we've said, going into this game following their win against the Broncos last week. So nice little chance to build some momentum here, and then finishing off with the Raiders in Week 18. And I suppose as a result of the Christmas Day games yesterday, which the NFL did, the Steelers lost, as well as a Ravens win over the Texans, pretty much means that the Chargers will have something to play for in Week 18 and they're unlikely to have clinched a seed in the playoffs, whether it be the 5th or the 6th seed or anything along those lines, even though they can clinch a spot. The seeding will still be up in the air in Week 18 as a result of some of yesterday's games, and that's a big deal, I think, for the Chargers. Obviously, we sort of talked about, could there be some scenarios in which they decide to rest some guys in Week 18 if they don't play Herbert or, select starters. But unlike that 2022 situation where we talked about maybe Staley doing that before he didn't, it doesn't seem as though the Chargers will be in the same position with a seed specifically clinched. So a little bit of a different vibe going into this playoff run. And so hopefully they can beat the Patriots and have something to play for, potential 5th seed. And that 5th seed is obviously important because that's a meeting with the Texans as opposed to the Ravens or the Steelers in the wild card round, which, based off of how the Texans have been playing, based off of a lot of their injuries, that is the easier first round matchup. Not saying it is an automatic win, but of course, I ran a Twitter poll yesterday in which I sort of asked, who would you most like to play on wildcard weekend between at Houston, at Pittsburgh, at Baltimore, at Buffalo? No one wants to play at Buffalo. But between those teams, who would you most like to play? 85% of you guys in that poll said the Texans. And I think especially after yesterday's game, they do look like a team that's a little out of sorts offensively. Stroud and Slowick just kind of haven't been on the same page. And then, of course, they've taken a bunch of injuries. The offensive line has been a problem. Their defense, you have the linebacker situation there, as well as the interior defensive line not getting much push. So hopefully the Chargers can win this week and maybe put themselves in a position to go to Houston in the wild card round. Let's see. As far as this game in particular, before we get into the Q&A, I do think this will be a little still tougher game. I mean, the Patriots do still have something to play for. I do not think the Chargers will just go in there and kind of blow them out from the jump, although that would be nice to see, obviously, if they could potentially do that. But the Patriots gave the Bills a little trouble last week before the Bills finally were able to kind of assert themselves and take over that game. Drake May played pretty well prior to some interceptions in the second half. And so, Jesse Minter talked about how well Drake May has been playing recent and the way New England is getting more confident in using him in some of the rushing packages even. So I do think this is not an easy chalk matchup, kind of like the undermanned Raiders team, although the Raiders won last week. I think they'll have an easier time by comparison with that game in Week 18 than they will with this game in Week 17, considering still a lot of jobs, potentially on, I guess there's jobs on the line in both scenarios, but Gerard Mayo, I think, is seen as much more up in the air as to whether they keep him as opposed to the Antonio Pierce thing. But we'll see. So a lot of interesting aspects to get into. I think how Minter, plays another one of these stud rookie quarterbacks, sort of like he handled Bo Nix last week. What does he have for Drake May? And then, of course, I think for the Chargers offensively, how do they kind of build on some of the progress they got against Denver, against the Patriots defense that is definitely undermanned, but has some key good contributors that I think will be able to slow the Chargers down a little bit. So definitely, I'm actually curious to see what the line is on that game, but I would probably bet on this being a closer matchup than what I think the general consensus is and what people anticipate with this one. I do still have the Chargers winning, but by how much? Style points. The Chargers are a 4-point favorite, which I think speaks to the Patriots not necessarily packing things in yet. And of course, going West Coast to East Coast for their final road games of the season. So all that being said, Steven and Tyler will be here to bring you post-game coverage on that will be Saturday. During that game, I will be with some family, so I'll still be tweeting and talking about the game and writing articles about it, but I probably won't do an episode of Bowl Breakdowns post-game until the Raiders game in Week 18, and then we know who the Chargers playoff opponent is finalized and everything of that nature. So yeah, I think I'll probably skip this week just to, finally get some family time being back in the States, but we will be back doing Bowl Breakdowns next week. So that's why I decided to take your guys' questions, and I wanted to get into them right now. So the first one comes from Garrett. Who do you want to see in the first round? Can't say Texans. So yeah, if I can't say the Texans, I mean, I think the most logical team after that is the Steelers. Now I think the Steelers are a very well coached team. I think it's still Pittsburgh is an incredibly tough place to play in the playoffs. That being said, they're dealing with their own injuries right now, and I just think, I don't even have to go through the roster to just tell you, hey, Mary F. Kill between Lamar Jackson, Russell Wilson, and Josh Allen. Who would you be most scared of going against? I think very few people would say Russell Wilson, and he looked pretty rough against the Chiefs yesterday. Granted, offensive line not doing him some favors, but definitely looking a little bit like Denver Russ in terms of a lot of the interceptable balls and a lot of the turnover-worthy plays I think he can make. So definitely not seeing the middle of the field great as well. So I think you would have to go with the Steelers, as much as I am scared of TJ Watt. And Joe Walt learned that lesson in week 4 or week 3, back when those teams matched up. This is a healthy Herbert who now gets to, return to Pittsburgh. And I think play a Steelers team that's obviously taken 3 losses in 11 days. League could have scheduled that much better for them. And the rest of the team's playing on Christmas, but it is what it is. So yeah, I would say you have to go with the Steelers if we're not allowed to say Texans. Favorite Christmas dessert or entree is a question from Garrett. I don't really know. What is a Christmas dessert or entree? I know people talk about eggnog, gingerbread houses, gingerbread cookies. I'm trying to think of other ones. Ham, I know, is a big thing on Christmas. I'm Jewish, so I don't know the answer to your question. My favorite Christmas entree is Chinese food. Had some great beef lo mein last night and orange chicken. Don't sleep on the orange chicken. What movies or shows have you decided to watch during the break? Obviously, haven't had a chance to watch too many movies and shows. But now that I am out of school, I have a chance to watch and catch up on a couple things people have recommended to me. I would probably go with... Ooh, this is tough. I decided to watch The Penguin because I'm a big fan of the Batman movie that they did with Matt Reeves a couple of years ago. So I'm going to watch that. I'm going to watch Severance, which I watched 3 episodes on the plane. So I'm going to check out that. And then I also wanted to check out the new Dexter prequel that they made. So I'm curious to see what that's all about. But those are probably the 3 shows, and in addition, if I watch anything else. But I don't know if I'll be watching too much TV over break. But hopefully I get a chance to check up on what everyone's talking about. This comes from JT the Nut. I'm actually really bummed they didn't get Diontae, referring to Diontae Johnson, obviously. Sucks to lose that close on a waiver claim. Talk me out of my disappointment. So I actually don't think Steven or Tyler have talked about this on the channel because they haven't done something since last Saturday. I think they did a Q&A type episode. But on Monday, when Diontae was released by the Ravens, he was claimed by the Texans and the Chargers. The Texans won the claim on waiver priority. They had weaker opponent strength of schedule. Why that's the tiebreaker, I don't really know. But the Chargers did register a claim for Diontae Johnson, which I think is interesting when you consider the state of their receiver room. And it was reported by Schefter and Rappaport on that Saturday prior to Tank Dell injuring his knee against the Chiefs, that the Chargers were probably, kind of the front runners for Diontae and the first team to look at on the waiver wire. So I think had Tank Dell not gotten hurt, the Chargers probably have Diontae Johnson on the roster right now, and who knows what they would have done in the receiver room, whether that's cutting DJ Chark or figuring out some other move. That would have been kind of interesting to see. But I think when you really look at what went into that claim, I think the Chargers have been actively not that happy with what they've gotten out of the fourth receiver spot. And of course, right now it's DJ Chark. Prior, it was Jalen Reagor who was doing the special teams duties prior, and sort of that fourth gadget, 10 to 15 snaps per game guy. That's what Reagor was doing. And then before that, it was Simi Fehoko before he got hurt. So I think they haven't been thrilled with Chark, and he honestly has looked a little slow on the snaps that he has played. So I'm not terribly surprised they're not using him more. I think it's less of a conversation about that more than he's just not kind of the player that he was able to be in camp. I thought he looked a lot better. So it's unfortunate, but I do really think the Diontae claim is about that. I do think they have three guys on IR, obviously. I don't think they love what they see out of Chark. And so if you can get a guy like Diontae at this stage of the season, you try and get him. And they tried to trade for Diontae Johnson prior to the trade deadline, as well as KJ Osborne was the other receiver that they were reportedly looking at. Don't know if they made moves for other receivers, but when I think about those two, it made sense based off of the makeup of the roster that they went for those guys. Now, am I super disappointed that they didn't get Diontae? Not really. I mean, I think the sacrifice that the Chargers made coming into the season with how they restructured the roster and moving off of Keenan, as well as, cutting Mike, the wide receiver position is something that is a future issue as opposed to a now problem. And I do think, Vlad has obviously come on really well. QJ has at least been productive. Palmer, I think, has come on as of late, but they still need more help, I think, long-term at that second and third wide receiver spot behind Ladd, who's getting all these targets. And then, of course, I think the supplementary guys have been where they've really, really lacked. So not surprised they tried to claim Diontae based off of what they knew, what they did before the trade deadline as well. Does that mean they could go after, like an Odell Beckham Jr. who's on the market? Maybe. I don't know. I think at this point in the season, it's a lot of marginal improvement. I think Deontay's not even going to play in Houston until the final week of the season to get some reps under his belt before the playoffs. But I think the Chargers are in a position where unless some opportunity comes out, this is the wide receiver group until the end of the season in all likelihood. So I guess for me, I'm not disappointed. Obviously, there's a lot of risk and baggage that comes with Diontae too. For me, I think if you were to pick him up, my pro argument was if you were to pick up Diontae Johnson and he's a problem or whatever, you can cut him. And I think the Jim Harbaugh culture is strong enough here to the point where they could have moved on. It wouldn't have been an issue. But if he does play well, then you obviously have kind of another weapon there. I'm not heartbroken about losing him or anything or disappointed, but I do think the limitation on this team as far as the playoffs is the interior offensive line as well as the receiving targets outside of Ladd. So would have been a nice dart throw to try to get Diontae there. Not surprised they went for him, although everyone on Twitter was surprised because, the Harbaugh brothers talk to each other. That was the reply I got all of Saturday. And then it turns out the funny thing I think about that logic that people ran with on Twitter is that not only did the Chargers try to claim Diontae Johnson, they also signed Eddie Jackson to the practice squad, who the Ravens cut like a month ago. So, I thought that little logic, that sequence there should tell people that these organizations, care about what happened in the other organizations less if there's still an opportunity for them to get something out of these, players. Anyway, Steven Gillard asks, what has been the biggest surprise of the season? For me, I think in terms of positive surprise, I have to go with Deion Henley. I did not think by any means that he would be bad this season, but I didn't think him coming into like camp period, rookie mini camp, second year mini camp, I didn't think it was a lock that he was going to be that guy coming into camp. Certainly as the linebacker one, we talked about potentially Colson handling green dot, Perriman doing a little bit of that, and they all sort of rotated that. But for Perriman to be, for Henley to be 60, 70 snaps per game guy, great as a tackler. I think he's fourth in tackles in the league, good in coverage. For him to be as rock solid as he has been, and Jesse Minter mentioned this part of it in his press conference, which was, Denzel being in and out of the lineup, other guys being in and out of the lineup, for Dayon to hold up as well at the linebacker one position has saved the middle defense. And there will still be some weaknesses to the middle of the defense, as we saw in the Tampa game. But I think Dayon coming on as well as he has as of late and throughout this whole season has been a massive, massive win for the Chargers, both this season and also going forward. At Smart785877, Higgins in free agency, is he realistic? Thanks for your work. Best regards from Germany. Happy holidays. Is T. Higgins realistic in free agency? So obviously he will be a free agent technically after the season. The Bengals did franchise tag him this season, so they can franchise tag him one more time. I tend to think that through whether it's a long-term extension or whether it's franchise tagging him again, that the Bengals are keeping T. Higgins. Now, I don't fully understand how the Bengals and Cowboys operate nowadays, because they do this thing where they basically will wait until the last possible second to be able to re-sign a player. And the thing that I don't understand about those organizations, as opposed to the Eagles, for example, you're spending more money by being as cheap and stubborn as you are on the front end. You end up spending more in the long term just to keep these guys. So that's always been a bit of a confusing part of how this all works to me. But I do think, Burrow talked about it, I think, at the podium once. I think one way or another, they will keep Higgins for another year, at the very least until 2026. And then, we'll see if they're able to reach some sort of long-term extension, also long-term Chase extension as well. But I think for at the very least 2025, they will keep him. Now there's some wide receiver names on the market between Keenan and Diggs, and there's a whole list of names that aren't jumping to the top of my head available for free agents in 2024 and wide receiver in 2025, and there's always wide receivers who get traded as well. So I do think the Chargers will invest, whether it's via trade, via free agency, in the wide receiver position. I don't think T. Higgins is happening, though. I do think he stays with the Bengals. At Chargers 357, how do you feel about Salyer getting more snaps? Not a huge fan personally. This is an interesting question. So Salyer is obviously, he had 5 snaps against the Broncos. He has been used in a lot of those 3rd and 1, 4th and 1 goal line situations, basically Roman calling him out situationally to be able to use in those scenarios as opposed to Pipkins. The thing that doesn't really make sense to me about the right guard position and how they've handled this since day one is I never fully understood why Pipkins was given as much rope as he was as the starter to begin with, because it was Jim Harbaugh who came to the press conference in June, I think during minicamp, and basically said, hey, your offensive line from left to right most likely is Slater, Zion, Bozeman, Pipkins, and Alt. And so this has been decided for a while. And then a couple weeks ago, I think when they were working Pipkins back a little bit from injury, then Greg Roman kind of insinuated it was sort of like a competition, but then Pipkins was still starting, but they're using Salyer in these situations. So the way that they've handled that from day one, basically kind of admitting okay, we're going to be comfortable with Pipkins taking his lumps in his first year as a guard, to then changing that approach midway through the season, and now kind of doing both of them depending on the situation. I always thought that's been to me the weirdest play on the offensive line throughout the season, because okay, you look at every other spot, Slater and Alt, bang up job, right? Zion, okay, let's see what he has at left guard. Bozeman, it's a buy low option at center, right? But the way they've handled the Pipkins thing has always kind of stuck out to me as a little bit odd. So hopefully we get some more clarity on what's going on at right guard, I guess, next year. Chris Pepper 616 asks what changes were made to the defense in the second half versus Denver. I don't know if they made a lot of changes. I think the thing that they were most confident with, particularly towards the end of the first half, they get that big Joey Bosa sack, a Dean Leonard stop on third down. And I think that really gave them a lot of momentum as far as going into halftime, getting 2 straight stops. The Broncos, I think, only scored 2 field goals basically after that point after that moment in the first half. I think the way the Chargers were playing on the line of scrimmage made them a little bit less confident about running the ball too, to the degree that they had success at that up-tempo run game on their first couple of drives. And I think that field goal before halftime really made a big difference in the game, because if you think about that score-wise, if you're up 11 going into halftime versus up 8, I think it changed how much the Broncos were willing to play downhill as opposed to, wanting to continue to throw the ball. And obviously, I think that made them a little bit less confident about running the ball with how the Chargers were playing. So I think it was really the pass rush getting home, the secondary holding up, despite Cam Hart, unfortunately, having to leave the game. Ultimately, I think, Cam Hart left the game against Tampa and then didn't play in this one. Despite the depleted secondary, despite, kind of hit or miss for the pass rush at times, I think they were really able to kind of just get momentum going into that second half about just being able to get a stop, because there was that period in the first half where they weren't able to get anything. But I think the way they covered the middle of the field was good. The way that they pass rushed was really good. And I think that just translated into being able to get consistent stops. I don't know if they really did anything that was different. I think it was just the fact that they were successful and basically kind of forced Denver to throw really not so great looks with how Bo Nix was playing. And, obviously the run game was not going well for them. At Herbie Loaded, do you think the Chargers should trade from Pitts and save him from Atlanta? Trade for Pitts and save him from Atlanta. Rivers to Gates is Herbert to Pitts. Do people still believe in Kyle Pitts? Is this like a bit people are doing? I don't mean to be rude, but anytime I've watched Kyle Pitts over the last 2 years in particular, I have not been particularly impressed. And I'm not just referring to the Giants, the thing he had in the Giants game last week, or, some of the other moments this season. But I think ever since he came back from his knee injury, he hasn't quite been the same athlete that teams have been looking for. And the problem with Pitts specifically next year is that he's no longer really on his rookie deal. And I think he'll be on his 5th-year option, which where Atlanta took him in the draft is, I believe it's like $10 million a year for that 5th-year option. And so that's what the Chargers or any other team that trades for Kyle Pitts would be taking on as a cap hit. And yes, of course, I think he's better than Disley. I think he's better than what Hayden Hurst gives you, right? But I think as an expiring contract with how expensive he is, maybe even if you're able to trade a lesser pick for him, I would rather just at this point go through the draft and go get yourself a Tyler Warren, go get yourself a Colston Loveland, go get yourself even a guy in round 2, round 3. Then I think making a move for Pitts like that. So, you still have Disley, obviously. If you can get something to the draft plus Disley and then maybe take like a buy low flyer option, that's sort of, I think, the best deal as opposed to going for Pitts, who I just think hasn't shown the best effort as a blocker. And then as a receiver, I think it's been, unfortunately, steadily downhill since the rookie year and then the knee injury he had. At Servando Bustillos, can you name 3 players you would like the Chargers to draft? So more draft talk, which is always my favorite to do. I have not watched as much tape on guys as maybe I have in previous years, but a couple that come to the top of my mind. I think in round 1, I really have circled in on Colston Loveland and Tyler Warren in terms of being the guys who I think make a lot of sense for this team, open up the field for Herbert a little bit, as well as open up the field for other, their other pass catching options. No, I don't necessarily have the most faith in Quentin Johnson or if they decide to bring Josh Palmer back, but if you have someone at tight end who really commands the attention of a defense, not to the point of like a Brock Bowers on the Raiders this year, I think that's a little bit much for Warren or Loveland expectations, but I do think they would open up the field for Herbert and give him a reliable safety valve in a way that he hasn't necessarily had in the tight end room outside of like maybe the Arizona game for Disley earlier this year. But I just think they need a little bit more juice in the tight end room. So that is kind of where I lean in round one, is like a Tyler Warren, a Colston Loveland type presence. And then I think my running back pick, I always talk about my running back pick and talked about Kamani Vidal last year. I really like Kyle Monangai a lot from Rutgers. Of course, it's a Rutgers pick, I know. But I think if you're not looking to take a running back super high, I think they're going to be out of Genty range. I don't think they're going to take Caleb Johnson in the first round. I think he's a little bit not quite the scheme fit that they're looking for, but Monangai is a guy I think you can draft in round 3, round 4, round 5. And he's a perfect pass blocker for this Greg Roman scheme. I posted a clip of pass blocking the other day. He's excellent in that capacity. I think he's more versatile than like Pacheco was when he came out in 2022. So ultimately, I just think you look at what Monangai is able to do, has enough juice, even if he's not necessarily the fastest running back in this class. I think he would be almost the perfect grade A fit for what Greg Roman and Jim Harbaugh are trying to do here, regardless of what you want to do with Dobbins next year and Gus Edwards. Regardless of what you want to do with those guys, I think Monangai makes a lot of sense. And then, he asked for 3 guys, so I named Warren, I named Monangai. It's tough because, again, I haven't watched a ton of people, but I think Tyler Booker out of Alabama, if you are looking for a presence on that interior offensive line that I think can change things a little bit, if you find a center that you really like in free agency, I think if you're able to plug in Booker somewhere on that offensive line and figure out where you want to put him, I do think he is, probably the best guard prospect that they can hope for in that, second round range, assuming they don't take a guard in round 1. But we'll see where Booker ends up going. So I don't want to necessarily say it's like a lock that he's going to be on the table where the Chargers are picking in round 2. The last question comes from Dread Boltlord, who asks for a Chargers offseason Christmas wish list. So this is obviously an interesting question. I think for me, the Christmas wish list is really some of the things that we've already talked about on the show. But for me, a wide receiver tight end help. I would say, a really dynamic tight end in the draft changes things a lot, even though it's not the best wide receiver class. I think if you get, one of those tight end game changers, a lot opens up for the Chargers figuring out what you want to do at center, whether that's draft, whether that's free agency with some of the names available. If you're not going to be running it back with Bozeman, which I assume that they're not, I think you kind of have to figure out what direction you want to go there and then build the left guard and right guard spots around what you want to do. And then the last thing I would say is a bit of an underrated one, but I do think figuring out the direction they want to go in the edge room is really critical. Joey Bosa, obviously, has not looked the same this year since he's come back from his injury, unfortunately, and is a very expensive player to potentially keep next year. And then Khalil Mack, as much as I love him, he's going on 34. And I do think you have to have kind of a succession plan, if you want to call it that. Now, Thule is obviously part of that plan. And I think you've seen enough good movements to obviously move forward with him being one of the top 2 edge guys on this roster at some point in the post-Mac, post-Bosa era. But I do think it is probably time to start thinking about the draft, to start thinking about, free agency as far as what you could do, depending on whether they want to bring Bosa, Mac, or both of them back or not, depending on what they want to do. Obviously, they have a lot of options. Now we have a lot of questions from the YouTube chat. That was just Twitter. So this comes from Zikloxy. What do you think of the Chargers' biggest strengths and weaknesses heading into the playoffs? I think the Chargers' biggest strength, if you want to look at it that way, is their defense. I mean, they rested on their defense and asked them to do a lot the whole year, but particularly Minter's scheme, the fact that he's gotten a lot of these above replacement performances from the safety room when guys have come in and out. Tony Jefferson stepped up. Marcus May has stepped up. Now he's unfortunately on IR. So the fact that they've been able to get some performances in the secondary, Eli Apple has taken snaps before he went on IR, right? Like the fact that these guys have come in and have been able to play in this Minter scheme is obviously a big credit to Minter, but credit to the guys who have stepped up here and there. The fact that the defense has not necessarily been at their peak health and is still playing as well as it is for the most part outside of the Tampa game, I do think is a huge win for the Chargers. And at least as far as controlling the score is concerned, it's what gives me confidence. I do not think the offense can keep up with like a Josh Allen or a Lamar Jackson in the playoffs. But if you get a Jesse Minter defense to force a couple turnovers here or there, right, like that can obviously have a big impact on the game. So I think their defense and how flexible their defense has been with talent, with injuries, I think that is a big strength heading into the playoffs. Herbert is a big strength heading into the playoffs. Obviously, not a lengthy playoff resume, but you want a big quarterback who has a strong arm that can fit throws in a tight windows in the playoffs. I believe he'll be able to do that regardless of who they play in the first round this year. And I think they are going to have a little bit more of a stable offense. I think the ability to have J.K. Dobbins back, which will get them at least kind of back to a league average type pass rush. They were 15th in EPA per play and EPA per rush weeks 1 to 12 with Dobbins. And then in weeks 13 to 16, they were 30th in EPA per rush without him, which shows, his impact. I think he is a needle mover for the Chargers is the term I would use, even though, a lot to consider about the long-term direction and the injuries. But I do think he's really important to this playoff run. Ladd obviously is going to hawk a lot of targets. So I do think they have some answers. And those are the strengths. I do think the weaknesses are the ones we've talked about. Lack of firepower on offense outside of like a Ladd type player is concerning. The interior offensive line is concerning, especially if you're going to have to go against Chris Jones in Kansas City, Madubuike and the defensive line in Baltimore. If you're going to have to go through Pittsburgh's defensive line and TJ Watt and Alex Highsmith coming downhill again, that is a weak spot on the interior offensive line for the Chargers. And so that, the lack of pass catchers. And then I would say I still am not sold on Jim Harbaugh's game management. I do think it was better against Denver, but I do think there's still been a bunch of times where the Chargers aren't quite sure what they're doing on fourth down, whether it's going for it, whether it's punting, and just like, the ideology there of like what their game management theory is, I don't think has been super clear. I don't think they've built an identity there. Whether you like Brandon Staley or Dan Campbell or not, and those guys who are really willing to push the boundaries on fourth down, I think the one thing that you can say about those guys is that they have an identity. And I still haven't seen what the game management identity is of this Chargers team when it's a close game and they're not up by 3 touchdowns against a bad team. So that's what I need to see more of. It was better against Denver, but I still need to see how they act and how they play in more of those situations. So I do think there is, still some pressure, not job pressure, but still some game situation scripts and stuff that Harbaugh needs to figure out. Let's get to the next question. Dylan Cole, we got a lot of free agency cap questions. Realistically, how many players on expiring contracts can we keep next year, even with $100 million cap space if we cut Bosa? Players like Puna, specifically, who could be playing themselves into huge contracts. So if you cut Bosa, like your situation says, and let's say you do an in-house extension, like extending Slater, you can open up well over $100 million in cap space based off of how it works now. We'll get into more of that during the offseason. But really, their only 2 big money internal extensions are Puna, who's probably going to make north of 10 million, I would think. And then Khalil, who I think is obviously edge priority. That's going to be well over 25 million. Whether that's a short-term or a long-term deal, remains to be seen. But between those two guys, I think you're at 30 plus million for sure. Outside of that, though, there's not really a lot of big money internal decisions for them to make. Like Denzel would be one, Christian Fulton wouldn't be one, but not much that would, that is like over 10 plus million average annual value. So I think really the two big ones are Puna and Mac, and you sort of piece it around there. And you obviously balance that with what upgrades do you want to bring in through external free agency as well. So really, realistically, they could keep everyone, right? If they want to run everything back. The question is, do they want to do that? And I think at some positions, they probably are going to be looking for an upgrade. Michael Torma, 4107, can the Chargers stay on the plus side of the comp pick formula if they trade for big contracts as opposed to signing free agents? So this is obviously based on kind of, what Ortiz's MO was last season. I do not think Ortiz will be as in love with comp picks this year, only because I do think they will have the need to basically they will have the need to go get external free agents, which will cost you in terms of comp picks. I do think the two methods that you look at as, hey, if you re-sign an internal guy like they did with Alohi Gilman last year, that's not going to count against comp picks. If you sign a guy like Will Dissly, who they signed after the Seahawks cut him, that's not going to count against comp picks because a team cut a player as opposed to letting them hit free agency, right? So there will be those little loopholes that I think Ortiz, kind of like last year, goes after. Whether a trade becomes available, yeah, obviously that wouldn't count for comp picks if you're able to acquire a player via trade. What trade opportunities are available? Hard to say, right? So I don't think you can base your entire free agency plan around that, but certainly something I think Ortiz will look into. Burley Johnson, excluding internal extensions, I just mentioned Rashawn Slater, who they can extend and open up some cap space. Where do you see the team? What do you see the team doing to spend that plethora of cap space we are going to have this coming offseason? Merry Christmas, Alex. Merry Christmas to all of you guys as well, of course. I think as far as the cap space, if you're looking at top three like external free agent positions, I do think it is wide receiver, interior offensive line, and probably edge. As like if you wanted to spend money there, you could look at tight end and stuff too, although I don't think that market's quite what maybe the draft will bring you. So yeah, I would say wide receiver, interior offensive line are really the two that I'm focusing in on in terms of the Chargers could spend a good portion of like their external free agent cap at those positions. That doesn't mean they're going to go like, T. Higgins and Trey Smith. Right. I think that's obviously a little financially impossible, but those are the two positions I expect them to probably give out the biggest contracts to, just in general. Let's see what else we have. At Morningstar 6170. Are we going to fire Greg Roman before the new season? Greg Roman can't, all right. I'm a Greg Roman hater. I'm not a big fan of Greg Roman's scheme, as I know many of you aren't, but he can't even get one good game in without you wanting to fire him. I'm kidding. But I think, look, the thing with Greg Roman is this. He's going to get another year to be the OC here. Whether you like it, whether you not, whether you don't, they're going to give him another year with the offensive upgrades that they're going to pursue from a roster standpoint in the offseason. And so he's going to be here whether we like it or not, or whether you like it or not, right? That's just, I think, the reality that you have to go forward with. So it's like, yeah, me, Steven, and Tyler could all make, here's our top 3 or 4 offensive coordinator candidate videos. But what's the point of doing that if they're not going to fire him? So I think that's very clearly where we stand going into this offseason, barring something truly extraordinary happening in the playoffs. Greg Roman's seat is very, very, very safe. And then the last question comes from NSN, a loyal viewer to all of us and the GAC shows and my show. It certainly looks like we'll end up playing the Steelers in Pittsburgh, keys to victory there. So I talked a little bit about this on the front end of the show, but obviously If the Steelers lose next week and the Ravens win, then the Chargers would play the Texans, assuming they win out. If, though, the Steelers win next week, then the Chargers, I think, even if they win out, are locked into the 6th seed, which would be a matchup with Pittsburgh, assuming they can win next week. So I think the key to victory in Pittsburgh is really making sure the pass rush gets home. Russ has not responded well to pass rush. He played pretty poorly yesterday. Through a lot of interceptable, kind of wonky passes, turnover-worthy plays. I think he has trouble, seeing over the middle of the field. That's been a thing his whole career, but particularly at his later stage with less athleticism, not a lot of ways he can kind of navigate the pocket if the pass rush is getting home. So make him more uncomfortable there. And then I think, you just kind of can't let them get their flow with a big, Mike Williams moonball catch or a George Pickens moonball, the big plays, and that's kind of how they kill you, right? Or Calvin Austin, or whether it's one of their running backs making a big play in the open field. Warren particularly has kind of the speed to be able to do that. I think it's about preventing the explosive plays from them, because then if you kind of prevent that and the pass rush gets home, they don't really have a lot of guys that just make easy offense for them. And I think you've seen that over the last 3 weeks in particular when they've gone up against some of the better teams in the league. I think the Chargers actually did a pretty decent job. Granted, it was Justin Fields at the time, shutting the Steelers offense down a little bit. And then when Herbert goes out of that game, and then everything just became totally unreasonable. But look, I think if you have Herbert in that game, I don't know if I would pick the Chargers to beat the Steelers in that one in Pittsburgh, but you would feel certainly much more confident about that matchup than the one where Herbert exited in week 3. So that'll do it for me today, guys. Excited to answer all of your questions. Really enjoyed doing the show. Stephen and Tyler will be back on Saturday to talk about the Patriots game and whatever happens in that one. Hopefully a win. If it's not a win, the playoff scenarios certainly take a turn for the worse, but I trust the Chargers to be able to kind of win in that situation. So hopefully everything goes as planned. Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah, Happy New Year to all you guys, and thank you guys for a great 2024. It was a historic year for the show. We got some cool guests that would not be possible without you guys during the offseason. And then, even though I'm not fully on the GAC pods, anymore, I appreciate all you guys that watch this little show that I do. And, it's fun to be able to do it every week and still have this kind of a platform. So thank you guys for watching. Beat the Pats. Can't stand Boston. Throw more tea into the harbor, and bolt up and fuck Boston. So can't stand them. Fuck Tom Brady.